everybody. Welcome to Connections Online. This is our presentation with the NSDM Retrospective. I'm Merle Robinson, and my partner here is Mark McDonagh. So we're going to spend the next roughly 2 hours talking about all the things we think we've learned in 33 and plus years. And I'm the new kid because I started around as a player in '97 and got on staff in 2001. So Mark is the old hand here. So he's going to pitch in pretty regularly on the presentation. He was teasing me that I've become the new face of NSDM since we've lost Dan, who his brother and one of the two founders, but we're going to move along here. All right, so we've been doing this for 33 years, professional quality war games, and started originally at DragonCon 1990, which was done in combo with Origins. And as near as we can tell, we're the oldest running event at Origins. We're going to talk about NSDM as a group and how our volunteers are organized, because clearly there's no money in this, at least not for us. We've got a not-for-profit organization, and I'm not going to read the statement, but essentially it's all about educating the public about how decision-making works, and then we use war games as the primary method of doing that, and we're 501c3. So this is the start of NSDM. I'm going to pass this off to Mark.
Yes, we started in 1990. You can see a picture here from Connections around 2001, I believe. That's I'm there on the left, my brother Dan on the right. Dan was at the Naval War College as chairman of the Wargaming department at the time, and he was called in 1990 to come into Origins. 1990 at that point was combined with DragonCon in Atlanta to try to give a demonstration or a lecture on military wargaming and professional wargaming at the war colleges. He offered to bring a demo game, so we went there, and he brought us in. At this point, NSDM has a core staff of Association of Volunteers. We've been nonprofit since 2001. We have a board of directors, and we have about 50 volunteers, depending on what level of commitment you want to call the threshold for somebody to be permanent or not. We have control staff from 9 U.S. states and 3 Canadian provinces. We consist of military veterans, government, academic, and diplomats. So we have a broad base of experience and expertise online. Additionally, we fill in with a lot of game geeks and hobbyists who try to make sure that we keep it enjoyable and fun and not focus too much on the academic nature of it. And some of the people have been with us for 25 or more years. We're completely transportable. We've gone to 15 states, and the District of Columbia. We've done 25 different venues, military, government, academic, professional, and mostly game conventions. Okay. These are the various places we've been.
Yeah, and the big three here are Origins, Gen Con, and DragonCon, which we're right now appearing at every year. And our staff helps support Connections Online, because that includes me. And you can see we do academic, professional, and hobby venues. Mark?
Yes, we do seminars and live action role playing. What we try to do, we don't really tell people at our game conventions that we're an educational game, but we try to be educational. We always hope and assume that most people will come out of a game knowing more than they did going in. Now it's interaction with intelligent competitors. It's a lot. You learn a lot more, and you have to challenge yourself a lot more when you're dealing with a human being that's working against you than when a computer, for example. Groups work agendas and budgets and try to fight for what they're told to fight for. So that makes a role-playing game in most respects. The core of the game, our core brand, is that it's the world as you know it. And we add some circumstances surrounding it, plus or minus, and we give them an opportunity and power to fix it, which they don't have in real life. So here's you are, here's who you are, here's your nation, here's what you believe in, here's what you want to work for. Go see if you can bring that about. We let the players run with things. We don't have a predetermined result we want to push things into. We look at broad megatrends, which way is the world going, and we try to incorporate that into the background and inject stimulated, realistic injects in order to try to make players talk about things and bring things about. So it's an educational game. We highlight the geopolitics of it. Who's important to the world, who's not important to the world, what are they what are they working for, and where are they across purposes, what are issues, current and potential. And we also have historical scenarios. We look at different cultures, political systems, and the developing technology to see where things are going. We try to encourage coalition building, public speaking, negotiation, and planning. This is for, again, educational purposes, where we hope that we're going to be catching on more and more. We have done some at high school level and a number of college venues. So the goal is to try to gain some insight in how decisions are made in the world by examining the circumstances, the culture, and the choices. We want to put players into these immersive environments where they, if they were just at a classroom listening to a professor or reading a book, it's abstract and they might forget that in the morning. But if they've actually role played through this, if they've experienced it, even in a simulation or a game, they're more likely to catch on to something. People learn in different ways, of course. And providing player agency of what they do makes a difference, that they can affect things and that they have power and influence within the nature of this game is absolutely important to the entire concept of where we wanted to start and where we're going with this. We, again, want to expose the participants to alternative cultures, the situations, motivations, and processes that are working. We highlight choices, consequences, and we are always there to insert the unintended consequences. Hey, you can't do A without expecting that B or C are going to happen. So that players always realize that the solution to their problems is not always as simple as you might think if you watch the news or listen to the politicians. Looking at the potential impacts of new technology to world trends, the science and technology aspect of it is something that we've been picking up more and more recently because the players in a lot of our venues want that. So we have science technology games. We also have science fiction variants of the game, although with our core is, again, the world as you know it in hard science.
Okay, let me hit this next one. Is that
okay?
The important thing here is we're going to talk about in the course of this presentation the general structure of our game and some of the mechanics on how it is played. We're not really going to talk about the individual nation states that we represent in any detail in this one, but we need you to understand some basics. So what we're going to show you here is the kinds of things that make us unique, because basically we do military style professional analysis and approaches as we build the nation state cells and the non-state actors. And the kind of structure we use for play physically at a location is very similar to that used in a military environment, because our roots are from the Naval War College. Both Matt and Dan, his brother, who founded this group, were asked to go to Origins DragonCon in 1990 to show civilians how the military plays. So we have a formal structure, we have a trained staff, we have designated roles, guides and rules, we have expert adjudication, and what we call player agency, which is that players get to drive the game. What's really interesting with us compared to most military games is we don't have a script. We have what we call story arcs and threads, and we'll talk about those a little bit more later. But essentially, the players drive the story, and it's a common narrative. So we have some similarity to other kinds of role play where we can explore counterfactual and factual situations in new ways and have player creativity inserted into the mix. So what that means in terms of the way we do things is our methodology is very much like software methodology. We have agile development. We do our research because we're trying to have the starting point of every game be real world. So we do relative analysis on the size of the economies, the effectiveness of the militaries, the general order of battle, and those kinds of things. We look at factions within the countries, the power structures, whether it's based on voting or whether it's based on economic power. We do analysis on how to model it. We try to figure out how to teach it. And then we try to see what we've done similar and adapt. So we're actually doing the kind of professional back office work that a military organization would do or a contractor would do in support of a government. And that means that we use a lot of the same techniques. Our original setup was we were using the DIME setup, which you see over on the right-hand side, and now we more and more often use PMISI PT, which means that as we do our analysis, we include all the essential things that you would expect someone to include in a simulation that deals with global, international, and domestic politics. So I won't go into much more detail there, but we want you to understand that that background is there. We also do some things that are not normal for a military organization, and that we adapt to the audiences in a different way. When we go to a professional event, and we've run several of those, we're very serious, and what I call the bumper guards on reality are there. As we move to a historical gaming convention, we're a little looser. As we move to someplace like Dragon Con, we're doing future simulations where we talk about things like, okay, you've got hydrogen fuel cells now. How does that change the world economy? It's 15 years into the future. Or global warming, we've raised the sea level by 9 feet. Those kinds of things change the circumstance and the kind of choices that players have, but it also adapts to the things that are interesting to them. So we're looking at serious topics in a way that tries to maintain fidelity to reality, but the degree of fidelity varies a little bit based on the audience. We'll talk more about that later on. So Mark, you want to catch this one? Mark, I am not hearing sound.
Yes. Yeah, this shows on the number of cells on the left that are contemporary and active. We have some inactive cells over on the right, and that number of things that have been so far superseded aren't even mentioned here. But of course, we want to be able to model the big ones: the United States, the People's Republic of China, and the Russian Federation. But we find also an awful lot of very interesting play takes place in cells like Indonesia or Turkey, where there's a lot of differences of opinion within the body politic itself. In our Cold War 1960 cell that we've now been running for over about 15 years, we have 6 cells we can model in that, and we've started recently building our 1980s version of the Cold War, the Reagan, Thatcher, Gorbachev era, and Able Archer, things like that. And we have a US and Soviet cell. We've experimented with that a little bit. We have a number of experiments, the most prominent being Doomsday, our Doomsday game, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we'll talk more about our Focus Crisis games. Where our current major development these years are in this last couple of years of the American Revolution game. We've got 250th anniversaries of key events in the American Revolution. We think there are people going to be wanting to look for what we have to offer. We might be able to even be able to package this thing up and turn it out to professors and high school history teachers who could run that. Unlike the Cuban Missile Crisis, we think it's a very good game, but it takes a very, very specialized staff who could run that game. So that's where we are with this at this point. Next. Okay. You want to take this, Merle?
Sure. The other thing that's unique with our outfit is that we work very hard to give people what I call Gestalt training in our in-briefs and try to make it very personal, where they take on the role of the group that they're representing. And they, in that role, have agency, which means they get to make the decisions, they get to change the policies, and that helps getting to immersion and buy-in to the role play point of view. So that all of these things come together as we move into actual play, and it becomes a collaborative narrative where essentially you've got the general themes, which are, for example, climate change and global warming and perhaps the rise of sea level. You've got story arcs that deal with that they can react to or choose not to. And if they don't react to it in the game, we don't force it on them. And you have individual threads, which are things that are intriguing, but not connected to the general storyline. Like there may be a struggle, a smuggling or a terrorist threat or something that's not a core issue for the game, but they can play with that and they can decide how big they want to make it. That all interacts with individual players' activity and the fact that each and every one of them has reasons to cooperate or be in conflict with other players in the game. We also like to really take into account what we call the law of unintended consequences, that there are things that they didn't anticipate or things that other players could be doing that they didn't anticipate. So what we're going to talk about next is the general evolution of NSDM over time. You can see we've had our baby steps and are now moving into the future. And essentially, this is our original 1990 format. I'll let Mark talk to that.
Yeah, 1990 when we first came to Origins/Dragon Con, it was an 8-hour game, and we for the first 10 years, pretty much our for over 10 years, our major game was 8 hours long. A move it was inserted, and a move took 60 to 90 minutes within that game, and a move was generally a year of real world time. We used paper briefs. We handed out a number of pages that players had to read. Came with boxes of copies. It took 45 minutes just to get the game started. Well, my brother Dan usually lectured and described the game while I assigned the various players to various positions, doing the racket stack process where we took into account if they'd said that had any experience in diplomacy in the military and this and that, try to get them to some place where they were had some experience. If they wanted to be this or that country, put them in this or that country. We used paper maps at that point. The initial years, paper map placed on a horizontal surface with paper markers indicating your units. When there were injects or things to announce, we just had to shout them out. That interrupted the game flow at times. Wasn't perfect, but we've learned from that. The emphasis on the game was on the P&B, or policy and budget sheet. This constituted the move sheet. It went through the nation's decision-making process so that the nation actually got together and fought over how they were going to move their policy, how they can move their budget, and it became the move for that nation. It was generally a year. It was a good model, but it was time-consuming, became tedious, and became boring. When we started to move away from 8-hour games to shorter games, it started to become impossible. Now, the budget, we used Axis and Allies rules in this, and we adapted them for a modern conventional and nuclear conflict. But the rule set as military wasn't important. What was important is that we had a background process and a background geopolitical situation. The game itself was within each country in terms of the diplomats and the politicians fighting over what it is they should do with the budget, what it is that they should do with the policy. The budget actually bought more military units that you put in the Axis and Allies map, and they moved and they did combat using the Axis and Allies rules. But the reality was, the way the game was structured, they were too far apart for them to be there to be a superpower conflict in the duration of the game. So it was really just a background system for them to play to. There was an emphasis here on the ideology, the distributions, and social cultural issues. Now, mostly our games are 4 hours. We began to get pressure around the year 2000, 2001 that 8 hours is too much time to expect most players at a game convention to commit to one game. So Merle, when he came in, we started talking about a 4-hour game, and he volunteered and wrote the first rules for 4-hour games, and he's been the lead developer for that since. It's now almost all our games are 4 hours, unless we go to a university where they want a 6 or 8-hour mode. We have additionally introduced 2-hour crisis mode games. These focus on international military operations. They have a set script and a scenario, so it's not within our primary brand, but they're very popular, and the emphasis is on trying to focus the players on action and put their ideologies away. And they're a lot of fun, but they're a lot of work to do to try to do that. It's not we'll continue to do it because it's in demand.
So the other thing I want to point out here, Mark, is there from the start of the game in 1990 to 95, one of the key evolutions that took place is you started with a very simple military model like the Axis and Allies setup, and we realized to have more realism that essentially you needed a more detailed and realistic military environment. So you started working on orders of battle and a different kind of combat mechanic for international conflict. Additionally, we still had a heavy emphasis on policy and budget and on governments making those high-level decisions. Now, those meant that for the most part, whether they were university events or public events, that you still were running our 8-hour games up until about 2001, when we started introducing some 4-hour games. So we're running a mix, and then ultimately to the point we are today that we tend to do 8-hour or longer than 6-hour events at professional and academic events, and almost entirely 4-hour events at public venues like hobby conventions, because there's so much in the cornucopia of the buffet that people can select from. So back to you, Mark.
Yes, as we mentioned, the original game, the game for the first 12 to 15 years was that it is the world as you know it, contemporary scenario, and we might plus or minus a few things to it, but it is the world as you know it. We started to put together a Cold War 1960s game. It's uh, Kennedy or Eisenhower versus Khrushchev, that era, early 60s, and it's caught on and it's run for pretty well. It's still not generally, if you look at the statistics, as popular as a contemporary, but it's part of our brand now. We additionally started to do various crisis games, historical and counterfactual. The Cuban Missile Crisis is at this point the most popular and I think the most educational of them. Future and science fiction scenarios came in around 2012 and beyond, and the most recent, the 1980s version of the Cold War game, the American Revolution game, which we'll be working on now, we'll be working on for the next 4 or 5 years. We had to reduce detail, and we went to 8-hour modes. So that's where we're at now, and a lot of the changes we made in the last few years have been to try to make effects out of going to 8 hours rather than eight, rather it's like 4 hours rather than eight. This shows the timeline, the core game of 8 hours. We started to put together a permanent core staff up till 1995. It was the Dan and Mark show, but we started to bring in more people in 1995. Fast play game introduced in 2001. The historical game in 2004, going to a 4-hour historical game around 2009. Next. Okay. And 2010 and beyond is a means of experimentation, largely with 2-hour modes. First, we tried a U.S. Civil War secession game, which worked all right. It was fun. It kept inserting historical injects. The world was that Lincoln's been elected, but it's several months to inauguration day. Can you avoid secession? And about 9 players maximum in that, and we kept sending historical injects of the various secessionist states and what their legislatures were passing to try to keep pressure on it. It was all right, but it provided us a lot of insights into how to do that kind of thing. And we used the model then to put together our Cuban Missile Crisis game. Over about 3-year period, introducing first the Havana game, then the Moscow game, and then the Washington game. And now we can run them all together or run them individually. And we've done that in live, and we've done that online as well. Our Road to War 1914, I joke with that being the games of August. I didn't get a whole lot of applause to that, but I thought it was clever. Our Doomsday game is a futuristic weapon of mass destruction barroom brawl. It's usually run at midnight. It's fun. It's way outside of our normal lane, but it's fun. The players like it. And around 2017, we started science, technology, and science fiction game, both Cold War and contemporary, 2 hours, often 2-hour mode, sometimes 4. And those are enjoyable too. A national security crisis game, etc. Okay, we'll talk about the tool, and at this point we're working on the Revolution game. Talk about some of the tools that we're using to make some of these work, and a lot of these are to try to make sure we can run something in 4 hours that at a war college would take 2 weeks. Before the convention, we have a lot of computers, laptops, monitors, software, etc. Make sure the batteries are all charged, the computers all work, the monitors are not broken. Get the maps, projectors, and everything there loaded up. We need consumables. We need a lot of paper. We had blank paper and printed paper, action sheets, pens, batteries, etc. And we pack them so that combat loading, so we know where everything is and can find it easily and a whole massive stuff. You see
the thing I'll point out there is, we've gotten to the point where we've gotten the minimum footprint for what we need to do at a con. It all fits in a van. And the one thing I'll talk about that we love to death, we found these painter scaffoldings that we can move stuff around even across handicap ramps and up and down elevators. I mean, our total lift load is 2 of these carts, and that makes things much, much better. But the thing to understand is we're operating just like a military outfit that goes out to do training or combat operations. It's all combat loaded. So what you see is we figure out what our footprint's going to be and how we're going to be organized on the ground for players to have resource areas in the actual game space. The different cell areas are cordoned off or marked. We have a command post, and we have a base camp for all our facilitators that represent all of the countries and organizations that the players do not actually play directly. So one of the other key things is our map tools component, which we had one of our fans join staff because originally we were using things like acrylic shower curtains for maps. And
Yes, this is the world as you know it, except it's made out of acrylic. And we move from there onto these actual maps these are cut out pieces of paper on the left side that are stuck up on these maps using Post-it glue, and it worked, but about halfway through a convention began the great snowfall where these things started to fall off the maps one at a time every few minutes. So that became frustrating. So we went to actual Post-its on the right. We printed these markers directly onto Post-its, and they stick up a lot better, especially if we, after the convention, take the maps down, stick the maps face to face together in a binder, and we're usually ready to go. Putting all those ideas together in 2005, we made the world out of two huge maps that fit on 3x4 foot poster board that fold over. So two of these next to each other form 6x4 foot map with Iceland in the upper left and Darwin in the lower right, which is our experience showed us that that's where almost everything geopolitically will happen. If we needed something else to happen somewhere else in the world, we added a world atlas. We opened up and we started to stick the markers on the world atlas directly. But these fold up into 3x2 each, and we can, with the markers on them, we can store them between events or immediately set up next time. Again, reducing setup time and getting right into the game. And we had to have two sets of those, one contemporary and one for the Cold War game. Now we've gone to around 2012, we went to an online map tool, and we're able to retire the others. This is a run through in every cell on the local Wi-Fi we set up. It's a common relevant operational picture stream to each room. I can, at my workstation on my laptop, click on one of these units and drag it somewhere, and it will be reflected in every game room everywhere. I could also put on explosions, refugees, nuclear biochemical contamination, tsunamis, hurricanes, tent cities. We even have a zombie marker. Good anecdote about that. I'll talk to you later, but we don't know. We're running out of time here. But we can immediately reset. When one game is over, we just restart the scenario back at the beginning, and it goes back to the original file, and everything goes back to exactly where it is again. An adaptation of this, we just put in another map blown up for the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is the 2019 game. You could see from this, if you look closely enough, that the 82nd Airborne has landed east of Havana with an Army armored division in support and a Marine battalion on their flank. You can see a Hurricane has just moved off to the west side. You could see that the Soviet submarine has just loosed a nuclear weapon in a U.S. ASW battle group, and that there is fallout across Key West rather, and you can see biological weapons used on Gitmo. So it's all there, and this is what it looks like.
We can project this on a big screen anytime we need to for players to understand the dynamic of what's going on in international combat.
And a player can go up to this and they can move that screen, scroll around, zoom out, zoom in, and they can mouse over one of these units and get more information on what one of the units is. Some of the setups, they could actually move it, but we have to keep tight control over which laptops could actually have permission to move these units. Usually just generally the one I'm working for. And this is it. This is actually from last year. This is 2022, 2023. This is our Revolutionary War game. You could see the British installations in and around the Boston area. You can see the Minutemen or throughout New England set up to try to be ready to move that to contain them. You can see Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point up to the north with the British garrisons there. Even out to the west, you see various Iroquois factions. I've moused over here one of the Iroquois units so you can see what it's about. We haven't factored the Native Americans in the background capacity yet, but that's something we're certainly going to do. And it shows the flexibility of the map tool that we can go from one to the other. Now, we can't possibly model and put up on the map every country in the world as far as their order of battle. But we did build this Excel tool for on-the-fly order of battle generation. And any country in the world, if you can enter the number of military personnel, the number of armored vehicles, the number of combat aircraft, and the number of ships, it'll come up with that reasonable order of battle. And you can look all of that up in the world military balance. And in fact, we have that on a spreadsheet with 200 line items. We could just enter the line item and we can get that order of battle up. So I can put together on map tools the order of battle for any nation that somebody decides they want to bomb today. We've put together consistent echelon notation. You can see up on the left side here are the common land unit notations from fire team unit to Army group. And we've extended that to maritime ships and aircraft so that giving you a sense of the strategic importance of a given unit on a map. And we post this, etc. And we're consistent with the size. For as an example, some podunk Central African warlord might have assembled his grand army of God, but if it consists of 600 12-year-old kids with AK-47s, it's going to have a battalion symbol on it. Whereas at the same time, somebody says, hey, why does the U.S. 1st Armored Cavalry Regiment have a brigade symbol? Well, if you look at size, you look at the number of vehicles, it's a brigade. So that way you could look at something, but you could also, in the background, of course, I can't say, why did your battalion kick my battalion? Because your battalion is 600 12-year-olds with AKs, and my battalion is 600 Special Forces operators. So at any rate, you very quickly get that up and give somebody a feel for what they're talking about.
So the other thing that I'll point out is because we're running public events and the shorter they get, the more we have to do summary adjudication and how things happen much more faster. Here are a couple examples so you can sort of see the kinds of environment that we get when we run a live event. This was one that was run for the ski cadets. This is pictures from DragonCon in 2019, pre-COVID. This particularly shows the first one is a game and the second is a presentation that we did. You can see Campbellsville, which is one of our university engagements. These are the high school teachers in the top picture in their first 10 minutes of reaction to seeing how their students have reacted to the game, because we achieved immersion very quickly, and the students were participating in a Cold War game. The first day, they were high school students. The second day, we did a contemporary game with the college students. You can see some more examples of how people get excited about the events, and we'll take end of event photos. And what we want to cover here is how the game format has changed over time, because originally it was very paper-based. They'd bring in Xerox boxes full of handouts because there weren't readily available projectors. There were paper maps and things on foam core that eventually we developed to the point where we had Post-its and they were pre-assembled and they could be taken apart and set up in minutes. And now today we're using projectors and monitors. We have a Wi-Fi network at every one of the sites. We have a news feed screen that is how we handle the injects, so people aren't standing up and shouting, hey, thus and such went on in the world, and every cell controller doesn't have to spend time doing that. We're doing a lot faster level of play, and we have military control electronics, which you've seen an example of. So when we talked about what our layout was at an actual event that we showed you in the earlier slide, this is how that all comes together and gels when we're on site. So now we're going to spend a couple of minutes talking about the structure of the game and what players represent. We are not going to talk about particular nation state cells, but we want you to understand the structure. So basically we have a game director, just like most professional events, and the game director at our events is basically there to control the pace of the game and the pace of our major inserts and story arc information. Their job is to see that everybody's having a good time and to see if there's anybody who needs any kind of help, because sometimes you'll have people that come into an event like this, never participated in one before, maybe not a role player, maybe not an extrovert, and they need a little coaching. So you look for people in the corner that aren't doing anything or engaging. You look for people who look puzzled, and that's what the overall game director does. Then we have military and economic controllers, which normally are one person, which is Mark, and that's to see that we know where a military unit is and it's only in one place at a time. He also can explain to civilians or less educated professionals about how long it takes to move the entire Marine Corps from 3 different oceans to Lebanon, if that's what you want to do. We have facilitators that represent all of the nations that are not active in play, and we normally run from 1 to 4 nation states as cells. And those facilitators are designed to react to player proposals and try to act in the way those nation states were. They will also act as staff for the players. So if you've got a player and they're the Secretary of Defense of the United States, and there's somebody who's never worked around the military, they're there to say, hey, this is generally how this process works. And your staff, professional staff, will tell you that when you invade Iraq, we'll be back by Christmas. We just don't tell you which one. It's because you can get the same kind of quality advice from our staff that you get in the real world, because sometimes staffs make mistakes. We have a cell controller, which basically administers all the normal things that go on in a nation state cell. They talk about how you pass legislation or issue decrees. They talk about how you handle elections or whether you handle fake elections, and they administer the national activities that the players take. That also means when we come up on it later on, we'll talk about action sheets. They're the main repository for that, because that's one of the ways we keep track of what the players are doing. And then, of course, there's the players who come in and engage and bring their creativity and their energy to the games and try to advance the agendas that we've given them as factions that represent real groups in the world. So players in our game represent large groups of people with goals, agendas, and resources. That's thousands and hundreds of thousands of people. And there's 2 kinds of positions that we have in our game. We have appointments, and positions are what we call roles. But appointments are things like you're the president, you got elected. You now have a whole cone of people that are in the executive branch that will support your activities to varying levels. For example, under President Trump, some groups of the federal government might have been slow to exercise certain things and others faster to do certain things. And we hear about those kinds of things in the news. The same with the Biden administration. So a cone of appointed that you're appointed over will have a mixed result in terms of the reality or our depiction of reality for how well they'll support the goals of the newly appointed person. But then you have roles for organizations that are totally internal. For example, you have different branches of a party, like the Democratic Party. You'll have different branches of government. You'll have different social groups. For example, in Iran, we have a group of small merchants, the Bazari, as we call them, because of the bazaar structure in Iran, no jokes intended. And they all represent groups with like-minded people with similar interests. And because there are hundreds of thousands of people, if somebody gets assassinated as a leader, John F. Kennedy dies, America still keeps running, there's still a president, and we move on. Essential attributes of our game include a number of things. One is that players have agency and have decision, and what we do to help enhance that process for them is to see that they have a gestalt sense of what their group is about. They get reasonable choices and circumstances to deal with, and then they know something about the culture and background of the folks. And we'll talk a little bit more about culture and background later, but that's the one area that we probably do the least effective job at, because culture for a country like Indonesia includes thousands of years of written literature and education that Americans generally don't have access to, and we have Americans playing Indonesians. Strategy and negotiation is a critical part of all of our games, and we try to include policy, budget, competition, and compromise. There's always internal and external tensions in any nation state that we try to simulate, and we try to push urgency because we're trying to keep the pace of the game rolling. We have some design constraints. One, of course, is time, and that affects both the length of time for the game, the length of time for training. We'll talk about both of those more later. Also, the constraints of where we're going to be and how much we can carry. If we do a convention in California, most of our staff's on the East Coast, so it's got to go by air. If we do a convention that's somewhere within the Midwest, we generally drive our gear there, and the costs are a lot lower. It also our design is affected by our audience. There are some scenarios that we build for the Dragon Con audience, for example, which are cosplayers and role players and sci-fi fans. Staffing is also an issue because most of the time we run an event, when we run an event for 60 to 80 people, we need about 7 staff persons to operate that effectively. And it's all volunteers. So there's the joy of that challenge, how many people can come to any event. The structure of our games are pretty simple. We start out with a briefing on how the game works for the players. We talk about the world plus or minus and any counterfactual issues. We hand out positions, and we warn them about people who played a lot because they tend to be a little more sophisticated or have had just more experience with our process. And then we put them in their individual nation states, which we call cells because they're not teams. And you'll get a little more sense of that later. And then we release them into the wild where they basically interact with one another, learn about national processes, and so on. And at the end, we used to have promotional items. We still occasionally do that we give away. We do a debriefing and after action, which is a good part of why we're very much like a military exercise or a military game. And it's what we call the excuse generation, mutual recrimination, and what on earth were you thinking phase. So Mark, I'm going to like to go here. Come on, there you go.
Okay, yes. We try to put together whatever aids we can, but remember we're constrained if we're trying to get a game up and running and played and debriefed in 4 hours. But a game brief, which has become shorter and shorter, trying to go to the minimum and insert more information as the game goes on. It's the world as you know it. We say plus or minus the following things if we want to try to push things in a certain direction. Try to identify who's who in the staff, who they need to go talk to, where the facilitator list is going to be. If they need to talk to this nation that's not played, go find the facilitator. And we hand out player cards. The player cards will show some examples of, but right now your ID is on that card on the front side, and your motivation, which is information you need to keep to yourself, what you're trying to work toward, is on the back. Cell brief, we give we break players into their different nation cells. You're the Russians, you're the Americans, you're the Chinese, you go over there, you go over there. This is your controller, and the controller will start to brief the cell on specific cell mechanics. And we'll put out aids, some handouts, posters occasionally to put things up. Milcon brief, usually the military people from each cell at some point, once they get a little bit organized, will come over and see me one cell at a time as military control, and I will go over the nature of their military forces, issues of their military forces, where they're deployed, which player owns or has operational control over which units, and let them then start deciding what they wanted to go, what they want to do. If they have some ideas, I'll start putting them in the right direction to starting their planning process. We have defense condition charts or DEFCON charts, especially for the Cold War game, which say if you're in DEFCON 5, which is your lowest state of readiness, to DEFCON 1, which is war, one for the Soviets and one for the Americans, and the players really fixate on that. You want to get their attention, bump the other guy's defense condition up 1 or 2 levels, and suddenly it will focus all attention on that, and we also will give them the feedback of what does that do to your economy, because you're calling up reservists, you're taking aircraft out of service so you can move military forces, etc. War plans, it was a prop. We had a couple of big, thick sealed binders full of just scrap paper that say war plan for the attack of such and such and such and such, and they could play with those. They could hand them around. If it's thin, the indication is that maybe we need to look at this more. If it's old, the indication might be we need to look at this more. We project the maps on the wall, and that provides people information with what's going on. Newsfeed is essentially a chat room that gets projected also, and that's how we do injects these days. Action sheets will go into more detail later, but those are in an abbreviated game of the kind we've been playing. Those are the move sheets themselves, actually. Staff, we have a facilitator guide. When we draw a super veteran out of the audience to help us be a facilitator, we say this is what you're to work to. Especially pay attention now that you are not trying to win the game, you are trying to help us to facilitate the game, make things work. Who are our staffing? What cells we have in progress, who are the right people to control those cells, and how many people should we put into each cell, and who makes inputs into the newsfeed, this chat system.
So the other thing to highlight here is this gives you a good example of how much we are like a professional military game. And the fact we've started to document these processes much more heavily is an aspect of moving from longer games to shorter games, because we had to ensure that all the staff was operating in a consistent fashion, and that we had all that material available absolutely ready before we start a game event. So now the next section that we're going to talk about is what kind of information the participants get. And although we're not going to show you all the different nation state cells and so on, we are going to show you some of the differences. And we started off with very long motivations, and I'm going to let Mark pick it up here, and we'll go through what we're providing to people today.
Yeah, the left-hand side is one sheet. We would have to cut that up because there are two motivations on that sheet. And one of the first things we had to do is start to cut up. But everybody gets one half page to a page telling them who they are, what they believe, and what they're supposed to work toward in both the free-form sense and the policy and budget sense. And they would give them a few minutes to study that, to absorb it. It is, again, their eyes only. That one player, he shouldn't show it to anybody else because that person now has the goods on him. But then start working, try to identify the people you can work with in the cell, the people who are going to be your committed enemies in the cell. And it took some time. The players back in 1990 seemed okay with reading a few paragraphs or a page or two and absorbing it. Players today, maybe the style has changed, but we find bulletized lists work a whole lot better than this free-form text. So on the right, we see the format we've been going to now, and those are two sides of a card. This is in this case, the Chinese hegemon player. He's a certain ideology. On the upper side is what he's going to wear. He's going to tape that to his shirt or to his convention badge. Everybody gets to see that amount to him, but on the back are what he's supposed to work for, and this is what his motivation has become, shrunk into this. It's become a challenge, but we've risen to it. We certainly lose some fidelity in being able to describe nuance, but a player can read that, absorb it in a minute or two, and then be inserted into the game and play to his role if he's reasonably good at it.
So here's the basics of how these cards work. They vary considerably from cell to cell, and obviously we have some cells that we prepared initially that are older, so every once in a while we have to do updates. This particular one is a card we've only played once with a 9-year-old because it was basically meant to be the demo. This is the Minister of Culture and Sports promoting cricket for Pakistan, and essentially the front of the cards show the signs, symbols, and tokens and public information about that particular player's cone of people that we showed you in that pyramid chart earlier. And when you see the back, this is the stuff that you show other people at your peril that talk about your motivation, some basic things that you're able to do, an outline of what your group's size or type is, because one of the things we point out in the presentations to players as we start up is, if you're the Democratic Party, do you have a hacker in your cone? Do you have a military expert in your cone? The answer is yes. It's all those people and the people support those systems. So generally players have a lot of leeway, and because we have an experienced staff, we can adjudicate the relative strength and number of people under different criteria that players want to use. That staff base is a big part of why we're successful. It also talks about any particular information that you need, knowledge as a player, and it lists our staffing level codes, and we'll talk more about those in a little bit. Now, the other key factor that we use to manage the game has evolved over the years into what we call action sheets. And action sheets are basically this type of thing. I'll let Mark cover the first slide here.
Yeah, as I mentioned, the policy and budget sheet was the emphasis in 1990. We became more free form, going away from actual moves, but rather a free flowing game. Required a lot of documentation, people writing things on notepads, scrap paper, what they're going to do, who's going to support it, et cetera, et cetera. Now, when Merle started to formalize the 4-hour game, we needed a standardized form, which he introduced in terms of the first action cards, and it basically forced players to give us the information we needed in order to adjudicate what this action was. So it said, okay, what players are supporting this? What is the nature of the action? And actually having a piece of paper was something that the staff could pass around and make sure we could keep this thing in our hand until we took adequate action with response to this. It kept the thing in the front of our memory. Advantage of this to help the player know how to get results, by getting, okay, sign up for this, put my name, get everybody involved who might be able to help support to get this action. It links the actions to the originator. Somebody now has to put his name down on this piece of paper to get on the record saying, yes, I supported this. Whether it works out well or works out poorly, he or she is down. It identified alignments for the staffs and the players. So who's supporting this, and who is not supporting it. The circulation of this became the process itself, beginning to supplant the P&B process and allow that to decay away to essentially nothing, which was where it is now, where the players had, okay, we have the world as it is, and we start modifying the country with this or that specific action, and we pass that around among the people who have authority and resources to accomplish that. And it's and at the end of that, we can have this stack of paper. And we say who supported what and who initiated what, and that will help us with player ranking, announcing who won the game and what their relative order is. It has some disadvantages. A lot of the players seem to focus on how many of these things they can produce rather than what the actual quality of each action done is. We could also log roll or bypass internal opposition. We've seen pieces of paper come through saying a nation is going to take certain actions with a bunch of ranking people in the nation having signed off on it, with the people in that nation who would be opposed to it not even knowing it's going on. And there wouldn't have been what reality would have been an internal fight in the nation. That's something that the cell controller has to go back and say, wait a minute, okay, I think we need to talk about this. I think we need to fight it out. And sometimes that doesn't happen. So there's some disadvantage to this, but at this point, it's a working process, and it's helped us to get the game running, and closed out in 4-hour period.
Now, one of the other things that's really helped us as we've moved into the modern era is we gave them a chart that matches up to the ideas behind the action sheet. We basically say everything you need to do involves having an idea, which you turn into a plan, and you talk about what, why, where, how, who that's involved in supporting it. And time passes, and then the staff will give you a result. That's an important component of getting to the next step. So, for example, what this does is it helps them wrap their mind around the problem. And you can use this in a lot of different environments, because here's an example from Star Wars. Why do I want to do this? I want to crush the rebellion. Where do I want to do it? The moons of Endor. How am I going to do it? Mass taxation and all these other things. And who sponsored it? And, the staff result might well be that the Death Star has been destroyed before it's fully operational. But the thing is, it helps them focus on a plan, and it's a way to move things forward. It also had one huge advantage for us in the staff, is that it forced us to give every player an answer to things that they had a question on. So it wasn't somebody would walk up and say, what about da-da-da? And 30 minutes later, you came back when you've got 20 or 30 people pulling on you for the whole course of the game, asking you, well, what was the result on this thing? That physical item ensures that we gave them an answer. The other thing that we had come up is the news feed, and I'll let Mark talk to the news feed.
Yes, when the game started out, the way we injected information is we said somebody in, we stood up, and he started to shout out to the whole crowd. Everybody heard it, but it also interrupted the flow, and to have that happen every few minutes became disruptive. So when we went to map tools in 2012, part of the map tools was this newsfeed inject system, which was a chat system that was tacked on to it. And we now use this in every game. We see the image here on the left is it projected up on the screen in front of the entire audience, so everybody could see this. And we could take an inject and select from what the source of the inject is. In this case, Pravda or NK or DPRK News or Al Jazeera. We have CNN. We have a number of different things, some of which are humorous. But it allows a short injects by staff players, and if something went up there that was important, people would gasp, and everybody would turn to look. But otherwise, people could walk up to there every few minutes and catch up on what the news is. They could also take the laptop that is projecting this and scroll up and see what has scrolled off the top of it. Keeps a log of activities so we can find out exactly what happened. This is on multiple screens. We don't interrupt the game with news injects, shouting things out every few minutes. Now we could also say if you see a report up from the DPRK News, for example, that you may want to question, whereas something from CNN you're more likely to assess that it's reliable. So you can lets the players judge for themselves how much they can believe something. And the players themselves will come up to our MediaCon and media controller and say, I want to produce the following. And sometimes they'll give you 3 pages and we have to paraphrase that into a line or two. And we've inserted tasteful humor inside stories occasionally from time to time, just to keep things light.
So the other thing we started doing was building cell aids, because the real key in the game was to ensure that players could make quick decisions and understand things visually. So we've done a number of experiments. Almost all of these we still use occasionally. We come up with debate ticklers, like issue cards. Like, for example, in the United States, there might be one on gun control. Pick a position, and we give the players a benefit for getting something decided or legislation passed, but let them pick the positions, and they can pick ones that are more compatible or less compatible with their own direct goals, because they can make compromises.
This is very, very good to use if a cell is lagging. If we have 3 cells in the game and one seems to be rather bored, we take out a handful of issue cards that we might have in our back pocket and we throw them on the table and get them arguing about something while the other cells try to handle their own hash.
Right. We also have weapons of mass destruction arsenal cards that we've used on occasion. We also have special cards, especially for the sci-fi units, because you can see the asteroid fragment card there down in the corner. Basically, these provide things on new technologies, special capabilities, things of that nature.
Yeah, these are good to give to a player who might be lagging, might not know what to do, or might actually be at a disadvantage in terms of the asymmetric nature, and he doesn't seem to know how to play that cell. If we give him a couple of special action capabilities cards, suddenly he's got something to do, and he can have fun. He's not likely to win if we just gave him the keys to the kingdom, but it's very useful to try to angle a game or insert a thread in some way or another.
So the other thing that we started doing was trying to build visual aids for the actual cells, so that people could visually and very quickly identify the mechanics involved behind how things are done. So what we've added are things like cell play information that show maps and how bills become a law and what the normal structure is, and economics. Things that are essential to them making good decisions, that we've tried to create more visuals. And again, we're better with some cells than others because they get updated over time. And there's some that there are more visuals readily available that we can borrow or procure in some way, that we can turn into an aid that can sit on the table. And that means that our cell controllers can talk to them about the issue and deal with people who are auditory learners. We have visual learners. We have kinesthetic learners, because these things are generally laminated in a protected sheet that can go around. We also have some kinds of play aids that we've started to work on, because we're recognizing that in general, there's much more general education, less education on geography and history in schools now. So since we have a more younger audience at a lot of these sites, we're starting to work on national profiles and trying to be very careful we're not stereotyping there, but national issues like, is gun control a big debate in America? Is abortion a big debate issue in America? And so on. And that we can try to have something that provides something on the worldview and background of a country that's not part of the Western sphere, because that is generally not taught in most public high schools in any depth anymore. So now, after all that background, so you sort of get the context, we're going to talk about the lessons we've learned over the last few years. And what we're primarily going to focus on are things that affect design and operation of the games. So these are the general issues that we're going to deal with. I'm not going to read the chart to you, but this is sort of the order of what we're going to cover. And I'm going to let's see, let me hit this one. One of the things that we've really found is that there's an issue of maintaining internal and external pressure in every cell. Our philosophy is such that we want to only simulate countries and cells that have internal and external problems, that have multiple options. So although we've experimented with places like Australia, we've discovered in gameplay, one, they're way too harmonious, and two, they're what I call the one-trick pony. They can do a military operation or a political operation in one space, not in multiple spaces. So that means the players are limited in their choices, and we really want players to have agency and feel like they're impacting the world. Essential elements that we have to be able to pick due to information being available and our ability to analyze it is the different factions politically, economically, and so on, which ones are asymmetric, the power dynamics between them, and what things they have that are key issues that trigger competition or cooperation. Our philosophy is that all positions should be able to win, even though that some of them we consider handicapped, and we handicap them in the way we do assessments at the end of the game. But all of them have to be fun, because if they're not fun, players don't learn anything. We've also talked, we want to talk about appointments versus positions, and we talked a little bit about that earlier, but essentially the key thing is we have to be sure that we're differentiating. What we discovered early on when we had a role for just a president, in a game, we want to be able to have the president run an election cycle. So if the president moves from one place to the other, we had to have appointments differentiated. So that's one of the things that we learned over time.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
we
As
had
an
to
example, as an example there, if I may, we'd have the various senators run for president. Somebody won, and suddenly he was supposed to give up that identity, that personality, that ideology that he had before, and take on the presidential card. The president, then offgoing president, took on the senator, who was somebody totally different. And that started, among role players, that's maybe okay, but it's not really the way to do things. We realized about 2004 that we needed to separate the appointments from the player positions. That series of the way to model is that series of senators have different ideologies, and they keep those ideologies, although one of them becomes president. President at that point becomes the authority, power, and resources of the presidency to carry out the ideology that he retained. So we differ.
One of
Go
the
ahead.
other things I think we need to point out there too is we still have some roles that look like they're appointments. For example, Secretary of Defense looks like an appointment, but it's a position in the way we handle it in the game. Because it's a large organization, if something happens to the Secretary of Defense, they go out and they find another guy in a business suit with the same background, talks the same language, has 30 or 40 years of experience, and that's the new Secretary of Defense. And the Department of Defense has a common approach in many things to how they lobby for support and how they propose solutions to the boss. So that particular position that you would think would be an appointment is really a cone. And that cone responds to any president separately.
Whereas on the other hand, the three service chiefs, the CNO, the Secretary, the Air Force, and the Army Chiefs of Staff, will potentially in some games compete to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Exactly. So I'm going to let Mark talk about nation cell manning.
Okay, yeah, we've learned how big or how small a cell can be, what works and what doesn't. We find that about 11 people are necessary in a cell for adequate simulation of the internal politics of that cell. We also find, and it varies from one of our controllers to another, that about 25 people is necessary for manageability and to avoid marginalization. Marginalization being that a player has can't get what he needs done because he's too small a fish in too big of a pond, or there are multiple people who are trying to do essentially the same job. So we want to keep most of our cells between 11 and 25 people. We've got to as few as 5 people. That's an executive game. That's good to put players in the country into play internationally, but skips most of the internal politics for that. A prime minister, a foreign minister, a defense minister, and then a security / spy master. And suddenly, the game's there, and they can have fun, and the other nation cells can play off of them. But if we want any type of internal politics, we probably need at least 11 people to simulate the right versus the left, or whatever things are in that area. Within a cell itself, we need to break that into subcells, usually executive, legislative, military, and some nation of theocracy. We find best making decision groups are 3 to 7. If you have smaller than 3 people in a group trying to make a decision. I call it the random dingbat syndrome. Some dingbats will start to take the decisions made by this group that can make decisions and destabilize a cell or start to insert really weird stuff. Larger than 7, we find that the group itself, it has time for everybody to talk for 2 minutes, and then they come together and talk, and it's not very satisfying for the players. They're too small a fish and too big of a pond. So what we will end up doing is breaking the cell up into subcells within the size. And if the cell, legislative cell, for example, is 8 people or more, we force them into committees so that we can break them down into that same 3 to 7 person discussion group. We also, in terms of how big the cells are, we find that more small nation cells are more enjoyable and more fun to play. But each one needs a trained cell controller, and the numbers that we have are going to be few. They need to assign space, and we need to set up monitors, laptop screens, other things to service that cell. So there's competing pressure to make fewer large cells with limited staff and the spaces that we have available to us. So while we'd like to have 3 or 4 11-person cells, we end up with 2 20, 22-person cells instead.
And from a play standpoint, a key thing to keep in mind here is you want decision-making groups that are always odd numbers. Because in very small groups, you run into deadlocks that basically make it so that the nation state cells that we run can't get any traction on any issue if one part of their organization is deadlocked. Mark,
Want me to do this? Yeah. Okay. We've gone through several different standards of how we want to rate positions, the player positions, and how we want to crew these up. And we've come together with this relatively consistent standard where the A-level positions are largely international and executive positions, the prime minister, foreign minister, defense, internal minister, and internal security. And like as I talked before about the executive cell, they put the nation into play in an international sense, but they don't do a lot of the internal politics. We prefer to have A plus B positions. The B positions insert the minimum amount of internal politics. Major factions and ideologies are going to fight over how the nation is going to be behaving in economically, industrially, militarily, geopolitically, et cetera, et cetera. C are other internal major positions. They're the maximum internal politics. Politicking. So our ideal manning for a cell are between a minimum of A plus B and a maximum of A plus B plus C. The D positions are extended internal. They're often overflow, and sometimes we risk marginalization. We insert them, but we have them available if we need to stick a couple more people in the cell. And they sometimes have some certain challenging and unique perspectives that we want to insert with the scenario. And we also designate some things as Z, either a Z level position or a Z suffix at the end of the C or D position. And those have special inserts, special focuses that they want. A cyber warfare person, a space person, the Uyghur separatists in China, for example. And we need to review what the C's are when we're putting the cell together if we want to bring that special flavor into that specific game. So that's the way we form. Go ahead.
The other thing that is really sort of our secret power that we do extensively that is not done by many professional games is we distort time in very weird ways. We want people in our games to see the consequences of their decisions. So research and development happens 2 to 3 times faster than it should. It takes a decade to field an aircraft carrier. In our game, generally speaking, from a budgetary standpoint and a structural standpoint and the kinds of number of decisions they can make that are major, we cover from anywhere from 1 to 5 years in gameplay. But there's certain parts of it that we play with. Every one of the cells is operating sort of concurrently, and there are major threads that we want them to be able to explore that deal with the counterfactual issues. For example, in a futures game, like you have a new technology, and because of that, what we've done is distort time. Things happen faster or slower than they should. Sometimes we'll slow them down so a country can make a decision that comes out contemporaneous with another cell. And we give the other cell things that aren't quite busy work, but are different things that occupy the players. Like they may get an issue card, and we encourage them to start arguing over that particular issue that's a national issue of importance, and that consumes their time so the other cell can deal with the component that they need to deal with. This is really, I think, one of the key dynamics that we provide. Mark, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, just wanted to point out the example. In one case, we had an entire U.S. presidential election cycle from the senators standing up saying, yes, I want to be president, to the primary process that narrowed the field down to two, and the election, and they gave speeches and had the election decided who the next president was. While that whole thing happened, which of course in real time, takes nine to 12 months, we had another player who was a Middle Eastern terrorist who had hijacked a jetliner, filled it with chemical explosives, was flying it across the Atlantic to New York City, and both things happened at the same time.
Yeah.
And nobody raised their hand and say, wait, this game doesn't make any sense, but it's fun.
And we've had
Did they enjoy it?
We've had some other weird distortions. For example, we had one game where a guy was elected president, and within 15 minutes he was impeached because there were two different cones of people within the cell that were working on a different kind of lobbying. Other things that we're going to talk about now are operational issues and lessons that we've learned. And these are the general topics that we're going to cover. And we won't read that to you. We'll just move on. And I'll let Mark talk for the fidelity.
Okay. All major roles have use. We don't want every player to think that they can do something. They have the authority over their position, that they have resources, that they can get things done. We want to explore the major issues and allow the players to insert their own issues. A lot of the games themselves, or the scenarios, are written into these motivations, that they can pick one thing out of this bulletized list, and somebody picks another thing out of this bulletized list, and suddenly the game is moving off in a different direction. We want them to be creative. How do I accomplish this motivation that I've been given, this agenda, what this goal I'm going to? And sometimes the players survive us. We're happy when that happens. But we have to provide an approximation of reality. We can't say we can't model the entire world, but we want the players to actually believe that it's feasible. The suspension of disbelief is there, and we have to play it in the time allotted. This allows for a lot of trade-off, or requires a lot of trade-off of simulation for playability, and we'll go into a lot of the details that later. The game is tailored to the audience. We'll run a different game at a university than we will at Dragon Con, as an example, and highlight clear deviations in the after-action reports. We've recently decided in our historical games, for example, keep track of things we've inserted that are counterfactual. Make sure we had the high school crowd at Campbellsville University walk away from there with some misconceptions about what really happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we had to say, no, this isn't really this happened. Those are counterfactual, but otherwise, if we don't insert counterfactual things, they're just going to be doing a kabuki dance and doing exactly what Kennedy and Khrushchev did.
And the thing I'd point out here is we often talk about in the end brief how we think we're adhering to or deviating from reality in our games. So when we're at a historical gaming event, probably our maximum fidelity is somewhere around 4, because we're trying to do it in a very, very limited time. When we're at a convention like Dragon Con, our fidelity is going to be more like 7, because we're dealing with futures issues and a group of role players.
So the game is primarily on the strategic to grand strategic level, but yeah, usually most injects are tactical or operational level. In the grand strategic level, you're ending the world, or you're truncating the world, or changing the entire direction of the game if you make an inject of that nature. Players are more often using 3 ships or 6 aircraft, or a squad or a platoon somewhere for something or other, and we have to go there if that's where they want to go.
So the other thing that's really a core that we've learned over the last decade is that instruction is a key component of what we've got to be prepared for, because the reduction in playtime has really created a number of distortions. One is it forces the sacrifice of some game detail. Game length basically means it's an issue for options, player agency. Sometimes we have to be more scripted in terms of the injects and happen more quickly. It decreases the time the staff has to make decisions and respond to stuff, where we when a longer game, we can get an 80 or 90% solution to trying to depict reality. Sometimes it's got to be more like 70%. It also means we have to impact the debrief time. So we've got to be very sure when we get to the end that when we talk about the things that are real and unreal about what happened in a game are critically different in terms of what we foot stomp.
Yeah, we wonder, for example, going to more bulleted lists of things rather than free-form text. Is the population getting a shorter attention span, or have younger people today assimilated a different method of accumulating information and knowledge and processing it? And we're just trying to keep up with the times and giving them a format that they're used to seeing.
Right, and what that's led to is that we have shortened the end brief. We have tried to maintain the out brief at about the same length, and we've implemented what I call the 1-minute teaching moment, because basically you can't tell everybody about all the ways you've handled adjudication until it comes up. So if there's no military crisis, we don't talk about what it takes to move military units around. If there's no political crisis, we don't talk about the difficulties of encryption, translation, and transmission between different actors. Those are very important components in a Cuban Missile Crisis game, for example, but if it doesn't come up, then we don't teach it. So that also has meant that we've created more of these play aids, posters, and references, and went to the more electronic and projected environment that we've talked about. When we're in a professional environment, we can normally work with people to get more advanced training and reading. For example, our Campbellsville engagement, I went down to the area and met with the high school and college professors for the event, and we talked about reading lists and what they want to talk about in class prior to the session, and we could give them play aids and instructional material ahead of time. And the audience change is the key thing that Mark talked about, which is we're seeing a reduced level of knowledge of international relations, military affairs, and geography. When I first started playing in the 90s, we had a lot of Vietnam veterans. We had a lot of people who were history majors. If you'd go to Origins, it was a historical gaming convention. People knew a lot. If you went to Gen Con, people knew less. But now we have a lot more younger people involved, a lot more role players involved. They have less patience with the fine details. As we were talking in one of the presentations last night, gamers' idea of complexity and simplicity and what's effective for them to get their handles on a game are significantly different now than they were a decade ago. So we really worked hard.
Point out, if I may, with that when we started the game in 1990, there was a Soviet Union. It was still around. So the two key players were the United States and the Soviet Union. A lot of the people who came in at that point, they remembered Vietnam, and they felt there was a certain American high that the Soviet Union was clearly in decline. At the time, the Berlin Wall was down. We had won the Cold War functionally. The U.S. military had been rebuilt from Vietnam. Saddam Hussein was making noises about Kuwait in 1990, but nothing had happened yet. And we felt the U.S. military was supreme. And there's a lot of the American high and a lot of interest and willingness at that point to first pay attention to some of these things, because in the 1980s, any American adult should be paying attention to geopolitics, because the world can end tomorrow. And whereas today, I think the young adults today are, a lot of them, I think, are more distracted because it isn't that important to them. They don't think they don't know that the world can end tomorrow, or the world isn't like it end tomorrow. So there was this shift in the American culture in terms of that they were interested before, and now they're not interested for these reasons. Okay, go ahead.
And I'll point out what that basically means is now we try to get the game up and running in 15 to 20 minutes. The old 8-hour games were very entertaining with the end briefs because Dan was a great presenter, and people loved to hear things they'd even heard in prior years on instructions, because we will often get 30 to 40% of our audience being repeat customers that want to see us at a hobby event. But now we've tried to shorten that and tighten it up, and we've talked about all that. So one of the other things that we've discovered is important over the years, and it's particularly become more important in the last few years, is to stress this is a game. And the reason that's important is we've had some folks that intensity of the game is a problem. We have people walk in off the streets at a public event. You don't know if they have any medical conditions, any past issues. We've had guys come in with post-traumatic stress and tell us, I have that, and we try to accommodate them and give them roles that be less likely to trigger that. And if they need a timeout, we've arranged for that to happen. One of the tasks of the game director is to watch for those kinds of things, particularly if you get somebody who's an introvert and they're not doing very well with their planning or interactions, they feel ganged up on. And we don't want anybody to have an emotional crisis because of what's going on in the game. So we pay a lot more attention to that. And we try to insert some things around the fringes to keep it fun. For example, if you noticed the news feed earlier, we had a reference to that was humorous about starting a chain of restaurants in Israel. And we've done things like, there's a running story from the National Star about the guy who's sighting lights over the South Atlantic, and he's an aircraft carrier pilot, and things like that, that will give players an amusement value and a distraction if they're getting too intense. The other things that does is it's tightened all of our briefings, and it's actually increased the time of preparation. In many ways, that's kind of good for us, particularly when we go to more professional and academic venues, because we have a lot more materials. We look more professional, even though we've always been professional. And in public events, it helps us get things up and running. Often what we've found is a lot of our volunteers have glommed on to the group and come to help us because they've seen the sophistication and detail and the care that goes into those things and into our public seminars and presentations. So now in terms of game control and organization, here are the kinds of things that we've learned. And Mark, will you pick it up from here?
Yeah, our core control staff consists of a game director, and I keep encouraging Merle. Merle's generally the game director. I keep encouraging him to disengage from any direct involvement for any long period of time. He needs to keep standing back, and we call it in the military the 5,000-foot stare, where you're hovering in a helicopter at 5,000 feet and looking at what's going on down beyond you. There is as a facilitator scenario controller who runs the different facilitators and sequences the injects. Milcon is generally me at my old laptop, and a con is also generally me at my laptop, and a MediaCon is generally someone else who is inserting things. But we need this size of staff because we need to avoid overtasking. We've done that before by mistake. It's frustrated players when they can't get a response from one of the core control staff in a reasonable period of time, and it frustrates the staff when things are backing up and they aren't servicing everything. So we've learned by making mistakes that we don't want to overburden ourselves. We do need to distribute the workload in order for the game to be in any way enjoyable for the players and not frustrating for us. As far as the pacing of it, there's a question of who's our venue. Is this a university or a science fiction convention? It could be there a thoughtful colloquium and debate over issues versus the NSDM barroom brawl, either internal external. And how we control that is our decision as to what type of pacing and how we want to burn the players out. In a 2-hour crisis game, the intent of the 2-hour game is to bring the cells to a rolling boil and keep them there, have the players out of breath when the game is done with, saying, oh boy, that was a trip. Are you going to do it again? Oh, well, I want to take 2 hours off first. Whereas an academic game, or generally university, we will sometimes have a crisis early so that they can get into their roles and start learning about each other and learning how the game is played, but then have some discussion time. And we're running several threads with moderate climaxes. They'll have an election or internal politicking that will be controlled and reasonable, and then more discussion time. And we'll often have an exciting finale, bringing one or more of these threads to a fruition. But we don't want to bring an 8-hour game. We don't want to bring up to a boil and burn the players out, because I've seen games peter out when everybody's just too tired. There seems to be some of a battle fatigue that sets in. Next. Okay, there's player energy, there's staff energy. It's a disposable resource or expendable resource. Now, the players sometimes ramp things up themselves. We always respect player actions. It's their game. We have scenarios, we have our own threads. We'll back off on those. So even if they're setting the planet on fire, we might throw a speed bump or two to slow things down, but we're not going to steer the game away, or we're not going to tell them, no, don't nuke him. It's a give and take. The players are burning things down on their own. we'll ease up on our own scenario thread to slow things down. When they're actually reached to fruition and they're tired themselves out, then we can go move in and restore our own control of the game pace. Okay, in online events, what we've learned is there's a problem here because there's a many-to-many problem in online that's difficult to do. We use Discord. Discord is a good environment for that. Uh, but in most of our games on site, any one player can talk to any of the other players privately. They can go off in a small group and have a dialogue, and they can often keep it secret. It's very difficult in Discord. You can always see if why is KGB1 talking to KGB3 behind my back. So a lot of the challenges are we need a common infrastructure and comms nodes. We do that. We have to assemble the thing, and we have for the Cuban Missile Crisis game at least. But we need multiple comms channels. We have a whole bunch of chat rooms that people can go in, and sometimes they can get lost in there and have some form of private discussion, both within their cell or whatever. Online events. We first run the Cuban Missile Crisis game. We've done it about 5 times online and Discord, single cell or up to 3 cell games, which are multiple cells more difficult. We expanded that last year and run online a contemporary Iran game, a contemporary Israel cell. We haven't yet run a two-player cell game online. That's the next thing we need to do. But each time we add a new nation, we need to put in each of their positions on Discord, so they have their player tools, they have background information they have, and their multiple chat and voice channels for each country.
And the structure of these kinds of tools basically mean to deal with the many-to-many relationship issue, we have to have a lot of private channels, a lot of hidden channels, a lot of structure. We have to be careful to have a lot of our materials available already uploaded. So the amount of work to do it the first time is 4 to 5 times what it takes to run a regular game. And even after you're running multiple iterations, it still takes more than twice the amount of staff prep. Now, one of the things that we've looked at is one of the things that could solve some of this is to build an artificial world like Second Life, or some systems like Neverwinter Nights let you set up like a tavern or a UN kind of facility and have avatars walk around. They can have private rooms to chat in. That sounds really cool. We think there's conceptually ways to do it, but it takes time, talent, and programming skills, and sometimes money. And those are things that are a premium because this is all volunteer and we self-fund basically. I'll let Mark talk to venue relations.
Yes, we got the conventions we go to, public events. These are the staff here. They're focused on making their convention providing return on investment. So they're looking at the money, but at the same time, they have a large amount of money that they could throw at you if they think you're worth it. And they don't care much about what we're putting on as long as the players aren't complaining and the players are happy. For example, at Gen Con, Dragon Con, certain sci-fi elements always bring in more players, and each player is giving convention cash. And so, as long as we do that, we try to run a number of games that are still true to our brand, but we'll put these things on in order to placate the convention. So the conventions have a lot of money, but the convention management we found over the years is often fair to very poor. A lot of them are volunteers that have been brought in to help with this or that. They're not paid very well. The core staff sometimes aren't going to be bothered with us as one of hundreds and hundreds of things that they're running. Professional academic venues, government, university, they have specific game goals. So they're more invested in the content that we're going to bring in, and we have to be in close communication with them to say, okay, this is what we're trying to do. This is how we're going to structure it, and they'll nod or they won't, and they'll help us and their feedback one way or another. So this is how we're going to do it. They have a budget. They're usually a lot more constrained than a public convention that's going to be bringing in 40, 50,000 people. So they're going to tend to be more stingy with what they're able to do for us. But their management, they care. Their management is professional and they're full time. Online games, we're usually asked to do a specific thing by whoever's putting together the online game, the moderator. There are not a lot of things we can do online at this point, but we're learning how and we're expanding our capabilities. and anything new needs to be developed from scratch. As Merle pointed out, 4 or 5 times the effort to build something, wire something together online, as it is to just print something out on a piece of paper and explain it to cell controllers, facilitators, and then we're off and on the move and getting it done.
So the two other things I'd add to this that are important to understand is we normally do somewhere between 3 and 7 engagements a year. To do an engagement, it's all primarily been self-funded, but if we go to a university event or something like that, just asking for expenses, if they had to pay for hotel rooms and so on, is about a $5,000 bill, even though we're relatively cheap, because we're not asking for salaries. So it's an important thing to recognize that that's part of the issue. So part of why we've incorporated as a not-for-profit is to try to find grants and other supporters. So the next things that we're going to start talking about are the challenges. And this is the real meat of our presentation. Even though we're going to increase our pace, we're going to talk about the things we tried that have succeeded or failed to represent the different pieces that we want. And I want to point out, experiments can be successful if they show you what not to do. And over time, we've discovered that with the time constraints that we've run into, moving from 8 to 4-hour games predominantly, that's part of the story. So the number one challenge we have is recruiting volunteers. So we're going to solicit all of you to try to join us too. Basically we do a lot of, we need volunteers to help with research, development, and operations. We offer mentoring and diverse thinking, and you can hang out with a bunch of cool people. And basically, it ain't no money. So we want to be honest, it's truth in advertising. But if you're interested, contact us. You can contact us on Discord for this convention, or via our other visits, and we have a Facebook presence. These are the kinds of things that we're going to talk about. And towards the end, when we hit policy and budget, the slides are going to move fast and furious, so you get questions in. So challenge 1 is dictatorships. And Mark, will you please take this?
Yeah, this has often been a difficult modeling a dictatorship in our game. Of course, we're built around a series of nation cells as being the player cells. But if we're going to put 12 or 14 people in a nation cell, and one guy has ultimate decision-making authority over everything, they generally don't have any agency anymore. The methods in real life in modeling these, sometimes how decisions are made in Putin's Russia, as an example, is not very clear in the West. How they delegate authorities is unclear. And they often dominate the media, and often getting rid of this or that person in their bureaucracy is very commonly done. Of course, we don't want a player who's played money to go into play a game to get thrown out of the game because the dictator doesn't like him. So multiplayer sales can be dissatisfying, as I said. One of the 3 approaches we've tried to this, one is that we first at the start of the game we kill off the dictator, and the players then get to fight over who becomes the next chief executive or head of the nation, including putting on constraints on what he could actually do. So it becomes a different type of an oligarchy. Or we don't even have him as the other approach. We've done that in the Middle East a lot. The king's not in the game. The Saudi Arabian king is not in the game, but you're all Saudis who are advisors and he'll do what we tell him is best. So you guys make the decision and they'll run with it. Sometimes we run a dictatorship as a facilitator cell. In other words, they're part of the game control group, and we put them into the game to do what we want them to do. So as far as some limited successes, the Vietnamese cell was a technocratic leadership. You might want to discuss some of these, Merle. You know these better than I do.
Okay. Where we've had successes are where we have one-party states or dictators running countries that have large bureaucracies or structures. The technocratic leadership in Vietnam is a good example. The old USSR, the current People's Republic of China. These are organizations that may have vulnerabilities, advantages, and disadvantages. They may have a sense or a perception of omnipotence, but they're accountable. Basically, you've got large structures that have agendas, goals, and budgets, and that gets it to happen. You also have, we've had some success with Cuba, where you had cliques of known individuals. We've made that work for the Cuban Missile Crisis game, because that's a very short game. It lasts 13 days, the way we've structured it. But when you have cliques, it often has issues when you can actually kill one person and the cone disappears, because it's not very deep. It's dozens or hundreds instead of thousands to hundreds of thousands. Also, we've had some success with experiential theories that parallel reality. And our Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, is a great example of that because we modeled it on the octogenarians that were there. And now we're getting ready to build a new model because that's broken down. But it's still so much fun to play. We tend to play it the old way when we're at a public event because people like to think of it that way, and it's a lot of fun. One of our other key challenges, and I'll bring Mark back in on this in a minute, is disparate cultures. There's limited information on a lot of these in English. And Mark, you want to pick up?
Yeah, some of these are different cultures are difficult for us to understand, and certainly difficult for us to train, and difficult for us to get Americans to do. A lot of there's some cultural bias or ignorance. We can see a lot of really stupid things happen if we try to put together a Saudi Arabian cell by Americans who think they know something about Saudi Arabia but never really bothered to learn. For as an example, a lot of stuff in Indonesia, rich or Persia, rich ancient cultures that are not written in English, and it takes a real academic in order to try to interpret what some of these things mean. Next slide, then. Next slide, Merle. Okay. So, for example, with Americans, it's hard to get Americans to actually think like theocrats. So, can we seriously model Iran as an example using American players? Well, if they're avid role players, we give them a little bit of information, yes, and they can have some fun with it too. But it's a challenge to get that amount of information into their minds. It's hard to get them. Today's Americans think like true communists. If we're trying to run a 1962 Cuban cell made up of hardcore communist Marxist ideologues in Havana, it's hard for them to try to understand or comprehend that, or try to comprehend 1962 PRC, as an example. And with Americans today, it's dangerous to get them to shun other ethnic, religious, and racial elements within their cell, even if it's an accurate model. For example, Arabs, including Arab positions into an Israeli cell, the Uyghurs in the PRC, or running the revolutionary game. We're very worried about depictions of people in bondage, aka slavery, or Native Americans. And especially in the current climate, it only takes one or two people to get offended or triggered in order to start pointing fingers and create a lot of problems. Another challenge being the historical perspective, getting the training time to get the players to understand the adequate detail or into the right mindset here. Next slide. No, back one. Okay, for example, most Americans today, if you try to put them in a Cold War game, they haven't grown up and lived knowing that the world could end on this particular day, knowing that there are thousands of nuclear weapons pointing at your country. Plus, in 1962, adult Americans at that point grew up with the attitude that we just saved the world from true evil in World War II, and that it's up to do it again. It's hard to instill that mindset in a young American today in 2023. Our new revolution game, it's hard to get Americans to conceive that, to recognize that the American colonists are seriously overmatched. They're taking on a world superpower and fighting England. It's also hard to get them to recognize that they were take on the position that they were raised as British citizens, and that they would feel a certain desire to seek reconciliation. And so getting that internal tension within the Continental Congress is sometimes very difficult to get Americans into that mindset. And okay, the people, the nations themselves, how dare they run their lives? We have a game on. You might want to take this, Merle.
Yeah, because basically one of the challenges here is keeping cells up to date in the contemporary era. It's very nice we've been able to polish and improve our Cold War games, historical games by a lot. We do a lot of research that's great fun for us as part of the development process, and it doesn't change generally because there's no new revelations that change the entire universe. But nowadays, people run their own countries and they have elections. So the French cell, the election changes too much, we can't use that model. We've got to redo it. We've run South Korea, for example, and their parties are so dynamic that they form and reform between every election. So South Korea doesn't ever stay current unless you've generated a new one every year. And generally speaking, we can do 1 to 3 nations with significant updates or redos in a year because it's a bandwidth problem for the staff.
Yeah, Turkey, the Middle East, of course, the face of a Russian cell has changed massively since the Ukrainian invasion.
Yeah. The other things that we have in terms of this is player challenges. So when we're running an event, you always have people walk in the door, particularly in public ones that you have no idea what their background is, or they've gotten to do no advanced briefing. So people's expectations are different. When people come to one of our doomsday games, which are what I normally call the weapon of mass destruction excuse to shoot at one another game, because that was done by a couple of our young staffers that saw a bunch of people wandering around at midnight and said, let's give them an excuse to fight. And they love it. We have almost 100 people show up that when we run it at Gen Con, people just eat it up. And it has nothing to do with our core structure, because their expectation is all they're going to do is do that. That's great. But if they come to a regular game and that's the first way they were exposed to us, it's a problem. Introverts in our game struggle. We have to work at that really hard. And some people are old school, hardcore gamers who say, where's the war? Because our game is about negotiation, compromise, and competition more than it is about war. So you'll have people come in and they may or may not engage. And some players try to role play and they get wild because they think it's a role playing game and they're a wizard and therefore they should blast something as a wizard, or they're a great assassin and spy and that they can pull that off. Because what we're trying to do, the bumper guards of reality, are an important component of what we try to do in play. Sometimes we do special accommodations, and sometimes we see people with antisocial behavior. We had one player for a long period of time who would come in, no matter what role you gave that player, they decided they wanted to be a terrorist. So they would do all kinds of shenanigans to try to see if they raised money to build terror cells. And that was their idea of what they wanted to do. So over time, we started to adapt to that as a staff. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But there are tools that we found in the kit to deal with players that are doing that, so it's not to derail the entire game for everybody. Potential solutions to a lot of these things are pretty straightforward and are not new to most professionals. But for example, sometimes people just need a better explanation. Sometimes they need coaching or hints. Like, I've never played a game like this, what should I do? Well, have you thought about your Israel that you might want to come up with a way to improve your economy, or you need to strike out at your opponents? And we will come to them sometimes if they're really, really struggling and say, you're the Secretary of Defense and your staff comes to you and says, you need this new weapon system. You should lobby for that. And that'll get them started. Once they get into that process and see how it works, then their creativity gets unleashed. The other things that we can do is adjust things. I can pick somebody up and move them from any place in any cell and put them in another cell. If you're not good being a dictator, killing mass numbers of people just to keep them in line, I can move you to America, okay? I can move you to France, where those are not standard practices. So that reassignment and adjustment is an issue. The other thing sometimes we do is promote them. We say, okay, would it be more fun for you if you played facilitator for Nigeria or South Africa or some country that is not exactly marginal, they're significant or significant in the story, but where you can give them guidelines that they will follow so that they will have fun, they'll get to see some parts of professional gaming behind the curtain, and they won't derail the game for everybody else. Because the thing to stress in all this, in public events, all kinds of people can show up. When you do a professional or academic event, you know a lot more about their background, you know they won't act out. So one of the other things that we do in this process is, and we try to be careful, but for most of our games, it's randomized delivery. And that's because we're in a 4-hour game. When we were running 8-hour games, we would often take requests from people. Do you have special knowledge or background? Are you interested in this job? And sometimes we'll still do that with the shorter games if people ask ahead of time. So if you've got somebody who's an Army lieutenant colonel and they want to be the Secretary of the Army, my gosh, more power to you. We also sometimes will target, and that generally happens when we have somebody that we've seen is either what we call a shark, and I'll cover that in a minute, or who is one of those folks that we've seen many, many times, and we know how they play, and we want their experience being maximized as well as the other people. The other thing we do in our games is we warn players about other long-term players, because they're what we call sharks. They know how the world works. They know how our mechanisms for giving them results work. Sometimes they're very creative and dominant. Sometimes they're very cooperative, but we want people to know that these folks are either their best friend or their worst enemy because they know how certain things work. So players need to proceed with caution. It's a challenge sometimes. So now this next section we're going to talk about, we're going to hit economics and then move into policy and budget. And policy and budget, hopefully we will not have to shorten because there's a lot to it. Economics and policy and budget are key parts of the 8-hour game. And we have really struggled with the ways in which we would handle it. We've actually implemented currency, and you can see what we called the gigabuck, a couple of forms, and the change that we gave out, which were what we called Grubers, because one of our staffers that passed used to like to tease people with gigabucks, and we would tease them they were a money Gruber, bad pun intended. And Walter would really love that we've done that since he's departed, because he used to have a lot of fun with that stuff. Because basically what we saw when we used currencies is dollar diplomacy had a really long tradition, and players wound up using them effectively, so effectively that it would distort a game. Because if you gave a relatively accurate representation of the number of discretionary dollars the United States has, one discretionary U.S. chit can blow the entire Pakistani economy in a whole new direction. So we had a big problem with exchange rates. We also had a problem with players that what they wanted to do was just accumulate dollars. So we would have fixation where money became the measure of success for some players, which really distorted the game away from the policy and budget issues and the international relation issues that we wanted. The exchange rates were a problem. And at one point, we actually tried to talk about gigabucks as influence, and sometimes we'd substitute chits for that and talk about it being that bribe to the guy on the border that gets the thing you want to smuggle out of the country. And every time we use those tools, we find that unless they're extremely rarely inserted into play, they come to dominate play because we have a bunch of traditional gamers at public events, and even at private events, professionals and academics can fixate on that stuff. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Mark?
Yeah, I just want to point out when we first started the games were internally focused at the U.S. cell with their politics, the Soviet cell with their politics, etc. And the budgeting was all in percentages. A certain percentage of the U.S. cell. We started to add nations like Iran or DPRK, and the percentages didn't match. So we started having to worry about exchange ratios. Introducing big gigabucks facilitated trade and communications internationally when the game began to become focused more on how these two, three, four nations are dealing with each other. We had one set of players in the early '90s who began to reverse engineer our game and game the game, and realized that they could find a way to, and they found ways to take U.S. money into Iran, translate it into influence or various other non-negotiable commodities, bring it back to the U.S. where it was worth more, turn it into money, and get a huge return on their investment. So trying to go to gigabucks got beyond that, but it does have this fixation thing, especially going back to American culture. You know, Americans seem to think that, okay, in addition to Americans being focused on money, Americans also realize that enough money and you could solve problems.
And that also rippled over into trade, because one of the things with that is it's all exchange rates. So another part of how we tried to size trade is we tried to look at what are significant deals. And one of the problems we ran into is players didn't know enough about the economies of countries that they were dealing with to know whether they were trading in arms or whether they were trading in certain materials. So we have some play aids and sources that talk about, you know, what's the number one product of Turkey? Well, one of the major products is automobiles. Americans don't think about that. So if they're going to talk to somebody, they can talk about, do you need automobiles? And that gives them the grist for the negotiation mill. So they can talk about where they're going to exchange or compete on different things, and helps them understand how the dynamics of real world international trade work. So generally in our games, we try to deal with things that are about $4 billion trade deals. So if you go for a wing of fighter planes over 10 years with support, that's about that. Or when you do some major deal with the Chinese for semiconductor chips, that kind of stuff applies. And that same kind of thing as we talked about is the issue with chips, because when we tried to use influence chips, If you start players at the beginning of the game with a couple, and then they spend them all at the beginning, then they don't feel like they've got agency to do other things halfway through the game or 3/4 of the way through the game. And you wind up with influence inflation, which distorts things in other weird ways. So those experiments have been mixed. We tend to use them very rarely now and tend to give them to players as discretionary or special funding. And when we talk about economics nationally, I'll talk again about chips when we get into the next section. Early on, there was a spreadsheet that I want Mark to talk about on how we handled economics with economic theory. And that's we've sort of evolved away from, but I want that background to be here.
Yeah, so it was always important to these cells that we give them GDP growth or contraction if necessary, and that gave them an idea if they're winning or losing, or if they're what their policies are. Now, I put together this GDP spreadsheet to try to facilitate this and make it very, very quick and easy to use. And as much as anything was built to try to encourage players to do the things that we wanted to see them do. They recognize that they can't buy everything they want by just raising taxes. There are implications or things that will happen if they just do that. Wanted to recognize that if they allow disorder, riots, protests, strikes, it's ultimately civil wars. That they don't put down that there's going to be an effect on their GDP, the national confidence. Are their people confident? But also get them out, get the various people out in their cells to other nations for trade deals. What do they have to sell, and what do they need in order to grow their economy? So in this case, we had this GDP growth, and our cell controllers knew exactly what I needed to punch into this, and I would tell them exactly what their GDP growth was for the year in a matter of seconds, how much additional gigabooks that was that they get to spend and get to fight over. And then the cell gets to agonize or criminate over the fact that the other cell is doing better because they got 6.8 and we got 4.3. Now, this is asymmetric. For example, Russia won't get as much for finding a market for high-tech goods than the Japan will. But if Russia gets access to a source for expert labor, they get more from that than Japan does because Japan can grow or has their own expert labor. So there's this complex matrix that fed into it, and we used Excel in order to try to spring through all that and get an answer in a second that otherwise might have taken us half an hour to figure out.
So the last part of this presentation is going to talk about policy and budget, and it's going to move really fast because we want to let you out of here on time schedule. So I want to point out we're going to continue to answer any questions people have from viewing this video now or later on Discord, and you can always communicate with us through our Facebook page. But basically, we're going to talk about policy and budget, which is one of our most beloved and sacrificed initiatives over the years. Policy and budget was very big in our 6+ 8 hour games because it really helped focus people to talk about social, political, and economic issues. It was a move sheet in a lot of ways, and because they generally were linked to the budget process, countries like America got a benefit for running a budget result twice as effective as others because we knew the American system took longer. This was an official move for these countries. It worked into their decision-making process, and it affected how they spent resources in a lot of different ways. So we're going to have the fire hose go on here for the next couple minutes because we're going to show you some examples of it. But basically, what it did was it showed where they shifted focus from one thing to another over time, and how our focus has had to change because the time to make these decisions are no longer available for the most part in a 4-hour game. So we will show people a starting budget as a benchmark so they understand the policy and structure of what their government's doing. And then we plus it up or subtract from it based on the action sheet. So there's more adjudication done at a more general level in a current game than an older game. So we went from plugging stuff into Excel and then grinding the crank and giving people quick metrics that way so that we could get past the math of doing it. But the negotiation of a policy and budget discussion still took a lot of time. So we can't really run turns that way in a 4-hour game because it's much more spontaneous and activities happen faster. So again, they're now benchmarks. They dominate a free-form structure. We use the action sheets to deal with changes to the PMBs. So here's some examples of how this has evolved over time. And we've got about 7 minutes left, so we're going to go fast. I'll let Mark cover these. These are some of the earliest ones.
Yeah, you can see each form is a little different for each country. These are year zero budgets, so the numbers are filled in, and they gave somewhat a baseline. But usually, by 2003, we had established the gigabuck as the spending. So when you see budgeting, you usually see something in gigabucks, whereas when policies are usually percentage, they need to add up to 100. And it gives you what the GDP is. The players can change change their tax rate and tax more, but they could expect some evolution or some degradation of their GDP growth with that.
You can
And
also
there's
see that these were very conceptual. They were on the broad brush themes of how a country operated, and there are a number of areas that were deliberately left out.
Yeah, just look at the POC. There's overall spending in very high level categories: military, domestic, and foreign policy orientations, and that's as simple as that.
So this is the next generation of sheets. This is a particular one that was done for US Cell that a lot of work went into. One of our staff that's no longer with us did this, and they had a whole bunch of stuff about trade and trade in different areas and subsidies, because the US Cell was run by itself, and it was very much an economic game in this particular instance. And we had a lot fancier laminated components that we passed to the players. It was really an interesting experiment, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on it right now. Then as we move forward, we took the traditional PMB that you saw earlier and built them into spreadsheets. And we used this for a professional event we did for the Marine Corps. And just sort of gives you how the formats have changed, but the contents are basically the same.
Yeah,
Now,
at this point, we're also moving away from projecting something with an overhead projector on a screen with a China marker in your hand to computer projectors, where the computer projector is being shown on the screen, and players could actually step in and work with this in an Excel format. Go ahead.
And as we moved away from the PMB, what we've also done is change the structure of it, so that basically this is the current format that we benchmark parties and groups with. And it's much more focused on the green parts are where the money comes from. The red parts are where the money is distributed, and talks about, discretionary spending. We take into account corruption and development and inequality somewhat in adjustments. And then we talk about those social and economic policies that might be regional. For example, in the Cold War, America liked to send money to certain groups of states, military spending. It was like Southeast, Northeast, West, and so on. And that was some of the distribution. In some countries, it's ethnic, that you put money aside for the lower costs in India. But basically, this is a much more real world portrayal, but it loses some of the flavor. And that's one of the things that we keep struggling with. We also did another experiment that used chips. And that was kind of cute, because what it did is it took this model that you saw here, and you'll notice that these are structured. There's only about 5 to 7 items in every category. And when you convert that into chips, what you can do is have a box, and every one of the little boxes is labeled that matches these things we saw in the prior chart. And what we do is we give them chips, and we give them a handful of red chips and a handful of green chips and say, vote for the thing you think should go up or down. And we said, based on some analysis, it looks like no nation state ever changes their budget on any one line item more than about 15%, unless they're in the middle of the mass Great Depression. So we're going to let you change that budget line by up to 15%. And the summary effect of you adding your minuses and your pluses to the things you like and that you don't like will generate an effect. What we found is that people tended to spend all of the chips on the one thing they wanted and spend all of the chips on the one thing they didn't want, and it led to really huge inaccurate swings. We also found in more dictatorial states like Russia, where the Russian oligarch, dictator, sat next to the box and told people where they should put things or he would remember them, which demonstrated that experiment failed utterly, but it was a lot of fun to try. So, basically, those are the things that we've had to cover, and we've come in basically on time. We've got a relatively small audience now, although we know a lot of people expressed interest and are probably going to be watching us. online, but we're still around for any questions here and in Discord. So I'm going to give people a minute or two to enter any questions they might have. And if not, we will close out. So I'm watching you all in YouTube to see if you have any final thoughts or questions.
I've got a couple of anecdotes I wouldn't mind going through, but let's go through any comments and questions
That's a
first.
good way to banter while we give them a chance. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, well, one of the first things we talked about the PNB, the process was sometimes slow and tedious. One game in Origins, late 90s, this 14-year girl showed up, brought to the game by her dad. And since the veteran player said, okay, that P&B, that's a tedious, they were USL, the P&B is a tedious thing. They made her the vice president of the United States and gave it to her to work in the background. So while they're talking high level things about international policy and diplomacy and military operations and this, that, and the other thing, and she'd show them the next P&B every so often, they'd look at it and say, okay, and sign it off. She won the game. Why? They gave her the keys to the kingdom. And she looked at, okay, this is what I want, and she'd add another percent here, another couple of gigabucks here, and everything moved in her direction because they started to ignore it. I remember our core staff started to form in '95. At that point, up to that point, it was the Mark and Dan game, and we were running absolutely everything. And I was remember being on the phone to Dan when he was talking about how, well, Origins are willing to give us this, willing to give us that. I said, would Origins be willing to give us hotel rooms for like 4 or 6 more people? Because we have a bunch of super veterans who enjoy the game, who are interested in showing up, and that was the beginning of our real control staff with that. We always said we weren't going to be doing an historical game, and then Dan said we're going to do an historical game, and so we put that together too. Are we over here, or are we still broadcasting?
We're still broadcasting, and we do have one question that came in, which is, do we have guides to help people learn how to run these games? And the answer is sort of, but we don't have a rule book that we can hand to somebody. Our tools are much more complex than most outfits, and the other part of it is the real difference with NSDM is not the hardware or the software, it's the wetware. It's the adjudication skills and game management skills that our staff bring to the events. And that's part of why we have sort of a unique niche in the community and are neither fish nor fowl. Also, because we're volunteer, we don't have the bandwidth to turn this into a formal game. The amount of expense it would take to run this is very akin to professional events. And the only reason we have the kind of handouts and play aids and things that we do is we've accumulated them over 33 years. Because each year we'll do 1 or 2, and then we've got another one, and then we'll do 2 or 3, and we'll have another one, and then we'll lose one because something's not accurate anymore. So now instead of 7, we've got 6.
Yeah, the game as it is involves Merle running it, involves me being Milcon, usually involves Robert Mosher being facilitator control. We change any of those 3, and the game's going to have to change a bit. If we try to pack this up and hand it to another group of people, it probably isn't going to work for them.
Now, we wouldn't be unwilling to train them, and we've had several mega gamers from different groups come in and do that. A bunch of folks from the Mega Game Coalition, it's based in the Midwest. We've had them visit us and train them. We've had some of the people who do mega gaming from England come, and we've shared our techniques. We've done stuff online for When Mega Gaming Con and gotten positive feedback, as well as constructive criticism from people like Jim Wallman out of England. And we're very appreciative of that. But we're a volunteer organization with all volunteers. We have 6 or so hardcore people doing development of different pieces. We've got 1 person who works map tools consistently. We've got about 3 people right now, 4 that are writing cells or updating cells. We have about 2 or 3 more that'll come to any given convention. And some of them only come to 1 convention, and they'll be cell controllers. It's taken a long time to do it. What's amazing is that over the years, the wheels haven't fallen off, especially when we lost Dan.
One of the things we'd like to do with the revolutionary war game we're putting together is make that something that we put together in a package. As I mentioned before, it's in many ways similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis game, but we need a very specialized team to run the Cuban Missile Crisis game. The way we're trying to design the Revolutionary War game is that a couple of history professors can do it. Some high school teachers with a good background in history can do that. Yeah, so we're hoping on making that something, yes, we could package and hand out.
Yeah,
But as far as
and that
anything
one,
else, yeah, go ahead.
that one's going to have at least 3 or 4 components, and they're being built over time. So right now we have the period of 74 to 76. We're starting work on the period between 76 and foreign intervention, which is a different kind of game in some ways. And then we'll be working on after foreign intervention, and we're talking now about doing a separate module on war in the West, because they have slightly different mechanics and issues, and we want to set them up so they can be played either together all at once, or they can be played in pieces separately. And I think we're going to be at the point where they are going to be packageable, but that's like a 3-year development for us. We're in the first.
Yeah, especially when I talk to some of our university professors saying we're interested also in examining the role of the Cherokee and the Creek and the Shawnee in the American Revolution. And they said if you can take a bunch of Americans, give them a core basic information to try to get them into those roles, so they begin to understand a little bit about what those tribes were thinking, what those nations were thinking. That would give us a lot of kudos academically.
Oh yeah, and I've already been consulting with some other people sort of in the field. I mean, I don't know if any of you do role playing, but the Flag Bearer Games people are doing an RPG on the American Revolution. And I stumbled across them, and we're starting to exchange information on resources and sources, because they're doing a lot of that kind of research, and particularly sensitive to the Native American positions and the differences between geographic regions, because you still have to realize that though English was predominant in the colonies, it wasn't the supermajority. We had a lot of people in Pennsylvania that were speaking German. We had a lot of immigrants that were dealing with different languages. There were a large number of African Americans that participated as freemen in the Revolution, much more than is normally made aware in general history training. So there's those kinds of things that we're trying to incorporate, and we're also working hard to try to figure out where the bumper guards of reality are. Because, like, if you're going to run a game on the American Revolution, you can't let Lord North die. That's a base assumption, because when the Lord North government falls and the British start having reversals rather than a big defeat, then he might not be in power anymore. So there are certain things you have to rule out of the game and in the game. And that particular game, and I don't want to spend the whole presentation on that, we did do a short version of how we were starting to design it for AC/DC's convention earlier in the year. Basically, all the players in the first part of the game are American patriots or American representatives of the Continental Congress. When we move to the second stage, that's probably still going to be the same with a couple military players. When we move to the third stage, the Continental Congress players generally will become secondary, and it will move to a military game. So that's a key part of it. And to run it, the first part's 4 hours to get people up and running and understanding. And it's more an experiential Gestalt game where you're trying to get the feeling of what it was like to be there and what the positions of the people were. It is not a game where high variability is going to make sense, because the colonists didn't have a lot of resources. There's a lot of real world bumper guards on that. When you move to the next step, they're going to get a lot of bad news for several years. There's going to be a few successes and some challenges. And we're talking about handling injects differently, so that our injects are actually on cards and have a description of the way we're implementing the event. And then on the back, it has the real history. So like the burning of the port of Norfolk will be on the back of the card with QR codes that send you off to a reference source. And the front of the card will say burning of a port. Okay, so those are the kinds of things that you would do differently for that. So as Mark mentioned, we will probably move to something that may be able to be packaged, but I expect we're 3 years away from that, because we're trying to do research to have it be accurate. I've got a tremendous number of books I've been soaking up in the last year, and it's frightening scary even to me. Hopefully, Robert, that answered everything you were after, and probably more of it. Any other chance for questions, anybody? We'll give you another shot at it. And I'll bring up our closeout slide. But if we get another question, okay. So thank you all very much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed your time here at Connections Online 2023. There's still one more significant event to come tomorrow. Brian Train is going to be one of our guests, and I should remember his partner, but I don't at the moment. But please consider joining us. That's going to be at tomorrow afternoon. So thank you so much, and we're going to end the broadcast.